Guys, can some hello.
Hey, Ron, how's it going?
It's been forever, my friend. It's been so. Our last show was in June. Is that correct?
I think it was in June. Yeah. So it's been
Wow.
it's
So
been
right
the
before
entire summer.
right? And so we went from completely over the whole entire season of summer, and here we find ourselves in the very opening of fall, which is an appropriate time to start Monday Night Monsters.
Hey, Mary, good to see you back again. Nice to see you, Jeff. Well, you know what? You guys are our regulars. We knew you'd be back. Pepper, excellent. Good to see you guys. So we're very excited about tonight's show. I'm very much looking forward to it. This, of course, is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. And so we're really excited to get started tonight. Hopefully you guys had a great summer and maybe we can spend some time at the beach or doing something fun. I know Ron and I were both very busy over the summer months, but it feels very good to be back.
It really does, yes. And I've got my steak handy and my garlic ready just in case. Conjure
Always
anything.
a good idea. I had plenty of extra garlic on my pizza tonight, so I should be good to go. No, I'm not going to lie to you. There are days that honestly, being bitten by a vampire doesn't sound like such a bad idea. So,
well, yes. Unless it's a Monday and you have to go back to work.
That's very true, especially during daytime. Don't want to get that kind of suntan.
That's right.
So yes, of course, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Monday Night Monsters. And as you probably already know, I am Christopher Rondina, and I'm a folklorist and legend hunter and author. And my co-host here, Ron Murphy, is also a legend hunter and an author and a cryptozoologist. And we spend these hours every Monday night exploring the things that go bump in the night. Of course, today what we're going to be talking about is, I think, what in my opinion is the greatest of all the things that go bump in the night, and that would be the legend of Count Dracula, the king of all vampires, and in a lot of ways the creature that probably put me on this path.
That's right. Now, you've been busy over the summertime writing a book, haven't you?
That is correct. That's very correct. I'm very excited that to announce that I have just published my seventh, I believe it is my seventh book, and might as well take that opportunity. We'll give it a little promotion here. So Hunting Dracula has just been released and is now available. You can go to Ghost Boy Press if you'd like a copy. This examines my sort of 30-year odyssey in hunting down the legend and the folklore behind the historic and fictional Dracula and where that all meets, which is very much what we're going to be exploring tonight. We're going to get kind of a little sort of a Cliff Notes version of the book, I think, will be a lot of our content tonight. And if you want to know more, obviously, I'm always welcome, happy to sign a copy of the book and send it off to you. So a little shameless promotion there. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that.
Yes, I know. I admire you very much as a person and as a researcher, and I'm sure it's going to be top notch. And because I got a preview a little bit of the slides that are going to be shown, I think that this is going to be an unbelievably great show as well.
Well, I certainly hope so. And again, as always, folks, please don't hesitate to ask questions. And if you're new to us, please click that like button, give us a subscribe, come back and see us. We do this every week. We take a break now and again, but we try to knock out as many shows as we can. And we're always happy to take suggestions too for upcoming shows, because there's a lot of strange creatures in the folklore world. We're always interested in hearing other people's ideas of looking to see. So let's, without further ado, let's kind of jump into the topic now. I mentioned a few minutes ago that this is a subject that's very close to my heart. In fact, last season, when we began the very first run of Monday Night Monsters, we launched with a show on werewolves. And to me, that's always been very close to my heart as well. It's a subject that I absolutely love, and I'm hoping to put out a book about sometime in the near future. But Dracula, in a lot of ways, for me, was kind of a real moment of epiphany. I like most kids, I grew up with Count Chocula and the Count on Sesame Street, so I knew what vampires were. But when I was pretty young, maybe 9 years old, I was first exposed to sort of the horror version of Dracula with this comic book series that was a Marvel comic. A 1970s series called The Tomb of Dracula. And my father brought it to me one day when I was homesick from work, along with a handful of other comic books. And I got to tell you, I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I was reading Batman and The Flash and Superman. So a horror comic book was something that seemed a little bit, I didn't think I deserved it. I thought, oh my God, my dad's going to realize that I'm young for this. He's going to take it away from me. But no, he didn't. And I read that thing until the staples were falling out. And I thought it was the best thing ever. And I became obsessed with Dracula and have been ever since. But we did a good show, actually a two-parter show on vampires during the last season. And so obviously we're not going to dive too much into what vampires are. I'm pretty sure that most of you folks, if you're here with us, know exactly what a vampire is. But of course, Dracula is the king of vampires in both fiction and according to much in the sort of supernatural world. And so I think it's going to be fun to explore that legacy.
It's become to the point now where you can say Dracula to just mean vampire as a term as well too. It's become that synonymous with it.
That one always cracks me up a little bit when somebody says, oh, you hunt Draculas, and I'm like, well, yeah, yes and no, but we won't get into the semantics of that so much.
Absolutely.
So Dracula, of course, is the most iconic vampire in history. This is a character who the character, from a fictional perspective, is supposed to be hundreds of years old, and from a historical perspective as well. And we're going to be exploring where the history and the fiction of Dracula collide. But as I'm sure most of you understand, the legend of Dracula in many ways began in 1897 with the publication of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. It was published in 1897. It has never been out of print in 125 years since its release, which is remarkable. That is that's a distinction shared by very few books, including the Bible and Sherlock Holmes. But I mean, very, very few books, even, some of the most famous writers still go out of print eventually, but Dracula never has. And Lord knows, we'd like to think that it never will. Dracula was written, of course, by Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker was an Irish novelist, but he was a novelist second in the beginning because he was also an Irish civil servant and a theater critic. And it is said that Bram Stoker conceived of the first ideas, the first sort of seedling for Dracula, after a nightmare in which he was being bled by a mysterious woman in white. And one of my favorite stories about Bram Stoker is that when asked about the origin, he often referenced that nightmare, but he had a tendency to say, and nobody really knows if he was trying to be funny or not, but he used to say, it was a dream that I had after a particularly rich meal of dressed crab. So apparently he was a seafood fan. So
that's a good story. And I know as a child he was rather sickly and in bed a lot of the time. And as rumor has it, right across the street from his house, looking out of his bedroom window, he could see a cemetery. So you can imagine being cloistered up in your house, sick. The idea of that sickness that is prevalent throughout all kind of vampire tales. The staring at that graveyard, that probably infected him very much as a young lad. And he brings all that kind of stuff to life because the book Dracula, even though it was written in the late 1800s, it is a good book. It's a good read. To this very day, it's still scary.
It is. It genuinely is, and you're absolutely right that the graveyard imagery was very frightening. to him. One of the things that when Bram was sick in bed, and actually they never really even fully understood what was wrong with him. He never had what anyone would call an official diagnosis, but he was sick to the point that he was virtually paralyzed. He was bedridden until he was almost 7 or 8 years old. But one of the things that would happen when he was laying there in bed day after day is his mother, Florence, would come in and she would talk to him, and she would apologize. Charlotte, his mother, Charlotte, Florence was his wife, but his mother, Charlotte, would come and she would tell him stories, and those stories ranged from stories of her youth, which, by the way, she lived through the great, cholera epidemics, and she would even tell him the stories about what she had to deal with growing up, including things like seeing her neighbors in mass graves, and truly dreadful stories. I mean, I'm not sure it qualified as good bedside manner, but she would tell him these stories of her youth, and she also, growing up as a sort of a rural Irish girl, would tell him about Irish folklore, and so he's heard stories about goblins and banshees and all those sort of things. And so there was plenty of horror stories bouncing around in young Bram's head. But this was also a period when bloodletting was still considered a fairly common practice, especially with rural doctors. And it is well established that while he was, sort of convalescing in bed, that he was often blood was taken by nurses. They would bloodlet him to let out the bad humors. And so Stoker's vampiric dream, in which he sees these frightful women in white bloodletting him, is actually maybe one of the core images that ends up turning up in Dracula, because as most folks have known, even if you've never read the novel Dracula, it's portrayed in virtually every movie version. Dracula, that Jonathan Harker, the young man who goes to Transylvania to sort of sell Dracula his house in England, is approached by these 3 ghostly women who attempt to drink his blood. And that's one of the first big terrifying things that happens to Jonathan there. And it kind of sets in motion the events that carry the novel forward.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, and you can see also, because I know that Bram Stoker's Dracula illustrated this in the movie, but they also the idea of exchanging blood as well too, through I lost the term, through yeah, well, whenever they
transfusions.
What's that?
Are you referring to transfusions or about the
transfusions? Yes, I lost the term. It was right on the tip of my tongue. But yeah, the idea of constant interchange of blood and vital fluids throughout the whole novel, and you can see that in the movie, in case you don't want to read the book, because the movie and the book follow each other fairly closely.
They do. Coppola's 1992 movie certainly is one of the most accurate versions of it, although it has its critics, because it referred to itself as Bram Stoker's Dracula and very, very much talked up how accurate the story really was. But it also ended up introducing a very, very new storyline, which would be the immortal bride idea. The idea that Mina Harker was supposed to be the reincarnation of his immortal bride, and that was, interestingly enough, a story that was originated almost certainly with in an earlier Dracula film, which was in the early 1970s. Dan Curtis, the man who created the Dark Shadows television show, did a film version of Dracula with Jack Palance turning in a fantastic performance as Dracula. But he was the first person to introduce that idea of the reincarnated bride storyline, which is actually becoming common in a lot of cinema, horror cinema, and really very common in vampire and in Dracula fiction. So I think Dan Curtis kind of started that off with Dark Shadows, which actually featured that storyline. He carried it over. He took his own idea, superimposed it into Dracula, and then Coppola would then later sort of lift that straight from Dan Curtis and put it in the Coppola film. So but it's become a trope. It's become such an iconic part of Dracula myth that a lot of people consider it to be inextricable and assume that it's in the novel, which it is not. So.
All right, yeah, but there's a certain romance to it, and without that little piece injected into the movie, I really doubt that we would see such things as the Twilight series, that is overboard romance, right? But the idea that somebody would, as they say in the movie, cross oceans of sand to be with somebody, that's a great romantic notion. And it also takes the monster out of the vampiric character as well, too, and inserts a little bit more humanity than we often see in these creations.
That's very, very true, and it's one of the most interesting aspects of the Dracula myth, is that the Dracula myth has completely divided into 2 camps. One is pure horror. One is the idea that Dracula is abuser, he's a devourer, he's for all intents and purposes a rapist, taking these women against their will. And then the other half of it has turned Dracula into the romantic and misunderstood hero. And both of them are very valid, and I think both of them actually have a very fair place in the canon of Dracula, because while it's true that the romance aspect has no presence at all in the novel Dracula, Stoker also grew up in a time when men were 100% in charge. Women were very secondary at that time. Women didn't have any respect, they had no autonomy. And the idea of the novel Dracula basically portrays every woman as a victim of Dracula. Every woman in that novel is a victim of Dracula. You have the three brides who are already dead in the, who live in the castle. You have Lucy Westenra, the significant, one of the significant characters who's, killed almost immediately. When Lucy comes back from the dead, just like the three brides at the castle, she's wanton and she's very sexual, and again, has become this sort of unbridled nymphomaniac for all intents and purposes. And then when he can't have her, Dracula moves on to Mina. But basically every woman is a victim, and they're all being all the men are chasing Dracula to rescue their women from this foreign prince who is taking them away. So the metaphor there already it's pretty much the idea that women need to be kept at home, kept under control, because if they're allowed to run loose, they'll become these lascivious sexual creatures. So it's not the most modern perspective on female liberation. So I certainly understand why the Dracula figure, the romantic prince that might take you away, would be, I think, in today's society, the more attractive option.
Well, it's kind of like 50 Shades of Grey with fangs. People will buy into almost any type of conceit.
Very much so, I think. So the interesting thing about Dracula is that, of course, the character of Dracula, the vampire Dracula, it hails from Transylvania in the novel. And when people think Transylvania, of course, they immediately think of Dracula and they think vampires. But strangely enough, Dracula got its start, despite the fact that Bram Stoker himself was from Ireland. Dracula really, in many ways, got its start in a little English village called Whitby. And Whitby is a charming little coastal town in northern England, in Yorkshire, and across the channel there, which you can see in the photo here, across the channel in Whitby, you have the ruins of this glorious old Gothic abbey. You have this big church in this churchyard, all of which feature very prominently in the novel. But the reason that this place features so well in Dracula is because Bram Stoker would actually holiday there. When Bram Stoker very began writing Dracula around 1890 or so, he was actually spending the summer in Whitby, and he would sit across from this great old abbey that's out there, and he would look across and see this sort of Gothic splendor of this great abbey, and it was very spooky. There were often very foggy days, but he'd see this old ancient ruin and was very inspired by that. Now, he had already conceived of the idea of Dracula at this time. The novel, at least in its rough sketch phases, but he found the visuals there fascinating. He found the history there fascinating, and one particular event ended up becoming kind of a staple of the novel, and that is the wreck of the Demeter. And this is a scene that is portrayed in almost every version of Dracula. The wreck of the Demeter was a ship that crashes in Whitby on the cliffs just below the old ruined abbey, and it's the ship that brings Dracula to England. And it's a fascinating portion of the novel, because in the novel, which it's important to note that Dracula is called an epistolary novel. Every single chapter of the novel is written it's from a letter, it's a journal, it's a person's first-hand account. So this entire novel is told through first-person perspectives of all the various characters, from Jonathan, from Mina, from the doctors who oversee Lucy, and finally the sea captain, who is the captain of this wrecked vessel. And it actually goes on to have all the various log entries, and you learn that this ship had left from Varna, which is a coast, which is a port near Romania, actually in Bulgaria, and that they had left from Varna with a cargo supposedly just full of boxes of silver sand. Silver sand, basically something used in the making of mirrors. And so they allegedly had all these boxes of soil, and that was their entire content. But as they travel to England, one by one, the people, the crew on the ship begin to disappear. And they become paranoid, and they think that there's a murderer aboard. They start to say that they're seeing this mysterious, tall, thin, eerie-looking man wandering the deck at night. And it's a really wonderful, really eerie section of the novel. And by the time the ship reaches England, every person aboard is dead, and a storm simply drives the ship into Whitby Harbor, where it beaches itself on a little place called Tate Hill Sands just below the old abbey. And the only living creature on the boat when it arrives is a gigantic, what appears to be a giant black dog who leaps from the ship onto the sand, runs up the hillside, and disappears into the graveyard on the hillside above. So it's a wonderful sequence of events, but I think what's fascinating is that it was based on something that really happened. Only 5 years before Stoker was there in Whitby, in 1885, an actual ship called the Dimitri, virtually an anagram, virtually a perfect replica of the Demeter. The Dimitri actually really did run aground on Tate Hill Sands, and the cargo on that ship truly was boxes of silver sand. So he was so fascinated by the story, and he thought it was so wonderful. He thought, what a perfect way for Dracula to arrive in England. So he basically took this entire story wholesale and incorporated it into the story. And that's what I think is most fascinating about Dracula, is that so many aspects of the novel were actually little snippets of real history. And I think that's why the story ended up becoming so successful, is because it had the ring of truth to it.
Yeah, because somebody could say, hey, I remember whenever that happened. So it does have this connotation of being, from a historical perspective, that this is something that actually happened. Although, it was a real literary genius to play around with the words. Demeter, the goddess of the underworld that emerges out of hell itself. We have that. And the other curious thing is that it was carrying silvered sand to make mirrors, which is something that cannot capture the vampire's reflection as well too. So we have all these great little things that the author is playing with there.
It's an amazing degree of synchronicity if you think about it. And something that's funny that is right in along those alleys is that the Dimitri had actually come from a Russian port called Narva, and it's a direct anagram of Varna. And Stoker couldn't have known that when he first, because he wouldn't have known that Varna existed at that point, and he hadn't yet established those parts of the novel. But when he saw Narva and he was playing around with it, somewhere he stumbled upon the fact that there was actually a Bulgarian port very close to the Romanian border called, quite a large port indeed, called Varna. And how perfect was that? So there was so much amazing synchronicity in this that there's sometimes that I like to say that it feels almost as though the novel wanted to be written, that there were so many amazing connections there, and those connections continued to come and continued to come.
Chris, I think that's a good point. If he didn't write this novel, this would have come to life in some way, with or without him. I do believe that as well.
Well, it certainly does feel that way sometimes. I mean, I don't really particularly believe in things like fate, but it is hard to say that it's hard to imagine that fate is not at play in here, because so many perfect little things lined up to create this character of Dracula, who the novel is, of course, a work of fiction, and yet so much of it is mirrored by things that really existed in history. And there's a little bit more to come. There's some fun little revelations I think we're going to talk about later that I think almost make it virtually supernatural, which I think is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But as I say, so Stoker he was at this place called the Crescent, which is on the other side of the harbor, and he would look across, and he would gaze at this old abbey and this old church and everything else, and he incorporated it into it. But while he was there, he also ended up going to a lending library and finding some paperwork that would end up really very strongly influencing the creation of Dracula. But the abbey itself is probably the inspiration, at least his first inspiration, for the idea of Castle Dracula, because even though the abbey itself is not a castle, the broken battlements he describes and the wind whispering through the through the broken windows and everything was something that I can imagine when he walked up the great steps up to this old abbey on the hilltop. It was very, very difficult to not think of it as a great haunted castle. And by the way, one fun fact about Whitby Abbey is it is simply infested with bats. And so if he was ever walking there at sunset, he'd have seen bats fluttering out of the abbey. So it was so evocative. It's hard to imagine that this wasn't, again, a huge part of the presence in his mind. It is, in fact, gorgeous, Mary. Isn't that a wonderful photo too? If you ever get a chance to go there, I certainly highly recommend it. The churchyard adjacent to the abbey is actually the scene of one of the most famous, most iconic scenes in Dracula, and that's when Dracula attacks Lucy. Lucy Westenra is one of the primary characters in the central chapters of Dracula, and she's Dracula's first real victim in England. He kills a dog in the form of this wolfish character wolfish creature which leaps from the boat. But the first real victim is Lucy, and Lucy becomes a vampire, of course, in the central chapters of the book, and much of the center portion of Dracula. Interestingly enough, the character of Dracula is kind of off stage, and a lot of the center chapters deal with the vampirization of Lucy Westenra, her rising from the grave, her beginning to feed on the children of London, because they leave Whitby, their summer home, and they go back to London, but feed on the children of London, and then her friends and loved ones making the terrible, very, very difficult decision to hunt her down and destroy her. But all of that begins right there on the the steps and in the shadow of the Abbey, and so it's really one of the most iconic locations, and again, a very real place. So how does this connect? This is I'm sorry for this kind of awkward segue here, but so we're talking all about the fictional Dracula. We're talking about the novel Dracula at this point. The novel Dracula was written in 1897, but I imagine that anybody listening to this must understand that Dracula is said to be inspired by a real historic figure, and this is a subject that has been a subject of some controversy. We're going to address a little bit of that. We'll go through tonight, but I think most of you have heard of Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula, the supposed historical influence or historical model for Dracula. And in 1972, it wasn't the first time it had actually been discovered or even printed on, but two Boston professors, Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu, decided that they wanted to look deeper into this supposed between a historical figure known as Dracula and the fictional Dracula. And so they went on a fairly extensive research trip through Romania, through Germany, and they started collecting the real information on this supposed historical character. And in 1972, they published a book called In Search of Dracula. And this was probably, I think it was almost unequivocally the most complete historical account of the life of the historical figure known as Dracula ever published. And much of their book was concerned with not just who this historical figure of Dracula was and how much reality there was to him, but how he connected to the vampire legend and how Bram Stoker may have ended up using him. And that has become the subject of some controversy because people think that they exaggerated or that they may have overstated some of those connections. But their work was impeccable, and they still to this day are considered to be two of the most extraordinary Dracula scholars who ever lived. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time debunking what they came up with. We're going to talk a little bit about it later, but I do want to talk about the historical Dracula himself and who he is. And so I think there is a lot of misconception, a lot of misunderstanding about who Dracula was and how much he influenced Stoker's novel. So I think it might be fun to explore that a little bit. So Dracula was actually born in 1431 in a walled village, a beautiful, beautiful medieval village in Transylvania called Sighishuara. Now, Transylvania, if you're not familiar with, is a region that the turmoil in this area over the last 600 or 700 years has just been outrageous, and the borders have shifted constantly. So Transylvania is a shifting territory, but at this particular point in history, it's actually part of Romania. It is the northwestern portion of Romania. Romania right now is made up of three principalities, Transylvania, Wallachia, and Moldavia. And those three form modern-day Romania. But during the time that Stoker wrote the novel, it would have actually still been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so that's why so much of the names in the book are German. People speak German all the time. So there's a lot of confusion about where Transylvania is, but it's a very, very real place. And Sighishuara is right in the heart of it. So in 1431, Dracula was born there, but 1431 was a very eventful year for the Dracula family because a man by the name of Vlad Dracul, who was Dracula's father, was invested into the Order of the Dragon in 1431. And the Order of the Dragon was a Christian fellowship of knights, and their sole purpose was to fight back against the invasion of Turkish forces, which had been overrunning Europe. Europe was basically under constant siege from their southern neighbors, which would be the Ottoman Empire and the sultans that wanted to expand their territory. And so these are some of the earliest crusades. And of course, the crusades would go on for centuries, but these were, some of the later crusades. So So in 1431, Vlad was given the title of Vlad Dracul. Dracul literally means the dragon. This was part of his investment in the Order of the Dragon. He became known as Vlad the Dragon. But that very same year, he gave birth to his, well, he was blessed with a second son. And his second son, the one that inherited his name, Vlad. He became Vlad III, and his name Dracula meant son of the dragon. And this is the name that would end up following him through the rest of his life and all through the rest of history. So this is the beginning of the origin of the character of Dracula. And I have to address something quickly before we move on, because it's such a common thing for people to refer to him as Vlad Tepes or Vlad Tepes, which is a Romanian term that means impaler. Now, that was absolutely a term that was really used for Dracula during his lifetime and in many centuries since. But I think it's important, and this is kind of a point of personal, sort of, I don't know, pride, but a standard for me, that was not his name. It was a nickname, and it was meant to be derogatory. It was meant to be a way to insult him, or at the very least, it was like calling him Slick Willie or Tricky Dicky. It was meant to be something that was not a friendly term. And so when I see Vlad Tepes, which is the proper pronunciation, on official documents, or on, people call him, say that he's, Vlad Tepes Dracula, that's not who he was. He was Vlad Dracula, and that's what he called himself. That's how he signed his documents. He signed his Dracula, and never, I don't think anybody who ever spoke the name Tepes in his presence would have lived long enough to brag about it to their friends. I can say that. So just wanted to get that one off my chest. So.
Yeah, we kind of like Ivan the Terrible or something along those lines. Usually that kind of moniker is given by your enemies. But it was a frightening thing as well, too, because especially when we think about this was an Islamic culture that there was the Crusades were against. And the idea of putting somebody up on a stake without a proper burial is a complete insult within that culture as well, too. So there's a lot of different things that are going into the making of what we now see as a monster. But at that time, he was probably par for the course. Wouldn't you agree? This was a time of very brutal lordships, and this was just a very violent time to be around. And I don't think that he was any more harsh than any other ruler of his day.
I think in some ways he may have been, but even still, I think that there's so much more goes into it. I think you're 100% right that it was an incredibly brutal age. This is just coming out of, really realistically, we're still in the end of the end times of the Dark Ages at that point. So we're basically barely coming out of the Dark Ages. Europe was over war. Almost every government was controlled by a religious organization. The Order of the Dragon was founded by the Emperor Sigismund, was a pope. So there were popes involved, but there were warring popes in Eastern and Western Europe. People's religious affiliations were not only incredibly important to their political aspirations and to their livelihood, but could get them killed. And this was all a part of the life that Dracula grew up in. He had a childhood that would be a nightmare by anyone's standards. I believe it was in 1442. He was born 42. Dracula's father, Vlad Dracul, was a vassal of the Sultan of Turkey. He was a vassal of the Sultan because his lands, Wallachia, he was the prince or voivode of Wallachia at that time, but Wallachia bordered Turkish-controlled regions. And so in order to keep from being at war constantly from the hugely superior Ottoman Turkish army, a lot of the people in places like Bulgaria and Wallachia basically paid homage. They paid tithes to the Sultan to keep the peace. So basically, they were under control on one side from the Pope and on the other side from the Sultan, and they were trying to keep this fragile peace. Now, the Sultan of Turkey, who at the time was Murad II, so the Sultan of Turkey had sent a force across Wallachia to try to attack Transylvania, and Vlad Dracul, Dracula's father, stood back and just let them cross his land. He didn't do anything to stop them, and that ended up getting him in obviously some incredibly hot water with the locals, with basically his own countrymen who felt that he was betraying them. So the Sultan's siege was unsuccessful. When the Sultan retreated to Turkey, Vlad Dracul was driven off the throne, and he fled to Turkey to hopefully get to Adrianople, the Turkish capital at the time, to hopefully have the Sultan put him up and basically give him safe sanctuary. When he got there, the Sultan said, I don't think you're nearly faithful enough to me. So I'm going to take your 2 sons as hostages and send you back. And you're going to know that if you betray me again, because I don't know how he thought that this was betrayal, but maybe he felt that he should have had troops in support. I'm not sure. But he said, you'll know that your sons are not going to live to, for you to ever see them again. So he basically took Dracula, who was 11 at the time, and Dracula's younger brother, who was 7 at the time, Radu, and captured them or kidnapped them and made them political prisoners. So Dracula would spend the next, I think, 8 years in under Turkish imprisonment. It's important to note, however, that he wasn't locked in a cell. It was the custom for a political prisoner to be educated, to be schooled, to be treated like a guest, but a guest with no freedom to leave. So Dracula learned the Turkish language. He learned the Muslim faith. He learned their battle, tactics. He learned their fighting tactics. He was trained to be one of them. The Sultan knew that this was a really good idea because he felt that if he raised these kids under his own roof and raised them with the respect that their station deserved, that he would be able to make them truly loyal and send them back at some point to actually rule Wallachia. And that ended up being what came to pass. Dracula or Dracula's own countrymen, the boyars, the nobles of Romania. I apologize. I know this is heavy on history here, but the boyars of Romania ended up assassinating Dracula because they felt that he was completely enthralled to the Sultan and they wanted somebody that they could trust on the throne. So they assassinated Dracula. When word of this got back to the Sultan figured that now 17-year-old Dracula was a perfect new puppet prince. So he gave him supplies. He gave him a small force and sent him back across the border to take Wallachia back and become his puppet ruler. And that was the childhood of Dracula, which is remarkable. So to think that this man would then grow up to be a brutal ruler and to have no tolerance for betrayal, having had his father assassinated, grown up with a constant threat of death over his head, it's not surprising that this man would be at the very least emotionally damaged and come to be known as one of the more brutal rulers that had ever graced Europe.
What? Well, there is a suggestion that he learned the art of impalement from his captors.
I've absolutely heard that. I have heard that. I don't know if there's any way to verify that is the case, but I've absolutely heard that. And in some ways, it would make sense because yes, the idea of dying unburied was something that's anathema to the Muslim faith. I mean, it's common in a lot of faiths, but there's such a faith-based culture that the idea of doing that to their enemies was an insult, as you pointed out earlier, but also terrifying as a potential fate. And one of the most successful tactics Dracula ever used it's worth noting that Dracula arrives back in Wallachia. He manages to take the throne back. I don't know how the heck he pulled it off, but he was a very man. Took back the throne. He didn't stay long. He ended up being driven off the throne in less than a year, but continued to fight for both the people of Wallachia and Transylvania, and sometimes fight against him because he had political enemies on all sides. This was a time, if you've watched Game of Thrones, you understand the world that Dracula lived in because you don't trust anybody. Everybody wants something. They're your allies until they're not, and that was the world that Dracula lived in. But at one point, Dracula's capital city of Târgoviște was under threat by the Turks. The Turkish army was marching on Târgoviște, and Dracula knew that he had no chance of defeating the army. The army was much, much bigger than his, and so he had a very successful battle against the Turkish force about 2 weeks earlier, and he had every single one of those prisoners impaled and had the stakes line the roads going into Târgoviște. The only way back then, you didn't have SUVs or anything. These people had to take a road or else they would never successfully get anywhere. So they were only going to travel by the roads. He lined the roads into Târgoviște with the corpses of the impaled, and they say there was something like 20,000 impaled Turkish soldiers. They arrived, first of all, to the stench of this dreadful army of the sort of rotting forest of the dead, and with the threat that if Dracula did capture them, that they would not go to heaven because he would treat them the same way. It terrified the Turkish forces, and they turned around and they went, which is remarkable. I mean, that's a tactic that he's doing it to protect his lands, and as brutal and horrifying as it is, it was successful. And you imagine that, at least in terms of his own people, he must have saved an awful lot of lives by doing that, which is probably one of the reasons that he is still so well respected in Romania and in Transylvania to this day.
Yeah, yeah. I have a friend who's from Romania, and he said he's almost like a George Washington figure, this kind of savior of the country. And I don't know if I would go that far as him being a founding father, but he was definitely somebody that cared about his lands, whether that was, had any kind of benign influence upon his people. Because I think at this period he was probably, every man for himself type of thing. But yes, he was definitely a cultural figure in that regard, that he did indeed defend his country.
And I'd say if there's anyone that he's comparable to in a strange way, it may be King Arthur, because the
Yeah.
idea of King Arthur being this mythical king that the people have always said, well, they refer to him as the once and future king, and they believe that he will return someday, in England's greatest time of need. And that's very much the way that the modern people, some of them, obviously not everybody, but have often, believed that Dracula, represents this figure, because people have said this. And while it's not 100% true, it's not entirely untrue either, is that if it was not for Dracula and his remarkably successful campaigns against the Turkish incursion over the course of that roughly 30-year period, Dracula had three reigns. Dracula was on the throne for a very brief time when he was 17. He didn't come back to the throne until the early 1450s. I think it was 1452 or so. He stayed on the throne for several years at that point before he ended up being deposed one more time, and then had one quick reign on the throne towards the end of his life. That was about a 30-year span, and he didn't die an old man, but he certainly, for the 15th century, living into your 40s isn't all that bad, especially in such a brutal time. But it is believed, again, among certain people in Romania, that if it was not for Dracula, that the entire area, that maybe Europe would be entirely Muslim and we'd always be speaking Turkish today. And it's not a completely crazy notion. He never completely defeated the Turks, but he held them off for years, often very successfully, and it certainly changed the course of the late Crusades and of European history. So one of Dracula's probably most notable contributions to history has got to be his eternal war against the Turks. And in a weird way, I believe that it's the culture that came out of that war against the Ottoman Turks and the Muslim culture that still lingers in our society today, because there is an almost baked in mistrust between Christian societies and Muslim societies to this day that dates back probably to the 1200s, when the first campaigns, crusades began, but certainly carried right through into the Middle Ages. So all of this is interesting, but it does beg the question: what does this Romanian Transylvanian warlord have to do with a vampire wearing an opera cloak, running around and biting ladies on the neck? And it doesn't sound like very much, does it? But one of the people who would agree with that idea, that there isn't much connection, was a Canadian professor in Toronto by the name of Elizabeth Miller. And Elizabeth Miller, I think it was in around 1999 or 2000, a book called Dracula, Sense and Nonsense. And Professor Miller's perspective was that the stories connecting the historic Dracula to the fictional Dracula had been blown wildly out of proportion, and that there was really very little connection whatsoever. And that when people say, and you still hear it all the time, when people say that Bram Stoker's Dracula was based on Vlad Dracula, the historic figure, that she took great umbrage at that statement, because it wasn't true. And she's correct. Semantically, it's not true. The idea that that Stoker based Dracula on the historical Vlad III of Wallachia isn't true, in the sense that he already had conceived of his book. His novel had already basically come. The basic framework of his novel existed. He knew that he was going to have a vampire as his main villain. He was going to set the story in the Austrian province of Styria. Styria was an area that had a lot of vampire folklore. It had generated other vampire novels in the past, including one of the real precursors to Dracula, the novel Carmilla, about a female vampire by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, who, as it turns out, Stoker worked for as a newspaper editor. So he wanted to set the story in Styria, because he said it basically already had the template for vampire belief. His vampire's name, the main name of his villain, was Count Wampir. It's literally just an older Slavic version of vampire. So he named his vampire Count Vampire, effectively. None of this is particularly interesting. So it was an overused location. It was a silly name, and we should all absolutely thank our lucky stars that something remarkable happened, which is that while he was in Whitby, he stumbled upon a book that was called sorry, wait for it. um, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. And one of the interesting quotes in the book, and the one that sort of changed the course of Dracula's history, was their voivode Dracula, also named Dracula, crossed the Danube and attacked the few Turkish troops that were stationed in this neighborhood. Mehmed, having turned his arms against him, drove him back to Wallachia, whether he pursued and defeated him. The voivode escaped into Hungary. Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. That weird little paragraph, which doesn't have a whole lot of information, literally changed the course of the novel, because Stoker found it fascinating. He loved the idea that there was an ancient sort of Eastern European warlord whose name meant devil, and he wanted to use it. But that really is hardly the basis for saying that this entire rich folklore and this entire character is based on this historic figure. It was only a tiny little snippet, and this was the linchpin, the crux of Professor Miller's argument, that Stoker knew very little to nothing about Dracula. It's a good point. She's not quite accurate, and this is the thing. Professor Miller's crusade in her own right against the idea of Vlad Dracula's connection was based, I think, on a great deal of semantics, and it became very personal for her. And she really, I think, carried it to a place that was less friendly than maybe an academic debate should have been, and it became a real point of contention. And so she and the pair of McNally and Florescu ended up butting heads a lot on the subject of this. Now, there is some good criticism to be thrown at Doctors McNally and Florescu. They went overboard in trying to connect the historic Dracula to the actual vampire folklore. They wanted to find evidence that Dracula, the historic figure, might have actually been seen as a vampire. And they probably fudged some of their research, or at least stretched it a little bit to cover that. People have wanted to throw out everything they've done as a result of this, and I think that that's insane. In fact, Dr. Miller herself, who was one of their greatest, absolutely most outspoken critics, bluntly says that their work was invaluable. Their work into the research into the origins of Dracula was absolutely invaluable. But they, I don't believe willfully, knowing these men, knowing that they were very well-established professors at Boston University, they had reputations to uphold, the idea that they would intentionally fabricate evidence seems highly unlikely. But they mistranslated a section of a German pamphlet. By the way, this is an important note. Dracula was one of probably the first real victims of a political hit, where the German Saxons, who ended up being at odds with him quite often, printed all these pamphlets which described him as this monstrous creature. They described him as murdering pregnant women, cutting their babies out, and all these terrible, terrible things, none of which there's ever any historic evidence to suggest happened, and none of which makes any sense. But in one of these pamphlets, known as the Bamberg pamphlet, it shows Dracula dining at a table among a forest of impaled victims. He's literally sitting there eating dinner among the forest of the impaled victims. And part of the pamphlet mentions something about Dracula dining among his victims, and there was a term that Dr. McNally ended up misinterpreting as blood, and believed that suggesting that Dracula would dip his bread in the blood of his victims. This appears, by all accounts, to be a mistranslation. Did they gloss over the mistranslation because it fed into their narrative? It's possible. You know what? Everybody's human, and everybody, makes questionable mistakes from time to time. They may have done it. It may have been an honest mistake. It certainly took a lot of years before they were willing to walk that back. But it did lead to some real controversy. And to this day, there's a McNally and Florescu camp, and there's the Miller camp, and they do not get along whatsoever. I find that I'm constantly personally being accosted by people who claim that everything that the research that McNally and Florescu did is therefore invalid, and it's not the way I look at things. But I have good connections to both of these camps, because Professor Miller called me out on a couple of poor conclusions that I came to in her book Dracula, Sense and Nonsense. I have the great distinction of being called out 4 times in the book. So wow. With notoriety and that. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand her criticisms were entirely valid. And as I say, many times over, you know what? That was my very first book. I was a very green writer, and there are times I want to disown it to this day. So we'll give her a pass on that one. But so how, in fact, if it wasn't through drinking of blood and Brett, how did Stoker end up making this connection between this strange, obscure historic figure and his vampire? Just the fact that his name meant devil doesn't seem like a good enough connection. It just seems like a very weak connection. So as usual, by the way, I'm behind on my slides here, but I do want to show you this one because I thought it was a little bit on the side. So how in fact did the 16th century warlord become a legendary vampire? Well, we discussed that piece of information that he found in the Wit Lending Library, but how would he have even stumbled across such an obscure piece of information? And most people believe that this came from a friend, not even a friend, more of an acquaintance named Arminus Vambery. Vambery was a Hungarian scholar whose primary area of expertise was Hungarian Turkish history. So basically, he considered himself a Turkologist. I don't know if he came up with that term on his own, but that's the one that people use for him. And that he had more understanding about the connection between Hungary and Turkish conflict than anyone. And he met Bram Stoker in 1890, in early 1890, at the restaurant connected to the theater that Stoker was managing at the time, which is the Lyceum Theater. And the idea that these men would have had a discussion that never, chanced upon the idea that Stoker was writing a novel about an Eastern European vampire seems a little bit suspect, especially since we've had so much rich knowledge of that region of the world. And so it's believed that Vambery is the most likely person that turned Stoker on to the topic of this Dracula character existing. But there is a really good reason to believe that that's true. It's not just a leap of logic. In the novel Dracula, when Professor Van Helsing, is telling the vampire hunters about the origins of this vampire that they've been fighting, he specifically says, "My friend Arminus of Hungary told me all of this." And so he references Arminus directly as a fictional character in the book. And what a strange thing it would have been to do, to just make that up out of the blue for no reason whatsoever. And so it seems, and again, this is speculation, and I don't deny that it's speculation, but this is one of the most likely pieces of evidence that he did discuss the origins of Dracula or the history of Dracula with Vambery, and that may have put him on and kind of threaded the needle and got him to be fascinated by this character. But Dr. Miller's big argument has always been, and by the way, I have to say that Dr. Miller passed away a couple of years, and I don't want to speak ill of the dead. She was an incredible scholar and somebody I had tremendous respect for. But I do feel it is fair to sort of address her argument logically. Dr. Miller's perspective was that Stoker simply didn't know enough about the historic Dracula, and that in his various notes there was no information that suggested he knew more than that one little snippet from that one book. But Dr. Miller was mistaken. Whether she simply never noticed this or never followed up on the reference, but there was another reference in Stoker's notes, and it was to another book with a much more extensive section on Dracula. It was Romania Past and Present by a fellow named James Samuelson, published in 1882. And among the many things in there, it said that the Turks were so much afraid of Hunyadis, this is John Hunyadis, one of Dracula's contemporaries, that they are said to have given him the name of the devil. But that same designation, as well as that of the Impaler, is also bestowed upon Vlad, a voivode of Wallachia, and who, with 1/10 of what has been related about him is true, had a much better claim to the title. He burned 400 missionaries and impaled 500 gypsies to secure their property in order to strike terror into Mehmed II. Now, that's a lot more information about the real historic character. It actually names him. It calls him voivode. It goes into much greater detail. And Stoker had notes about this book in his notes for Dracula. So we know he knew a lot more about Dracula than we originally thought. And so the idea is that clearly he had the template for the historical character in mind when he started to flesh out Dracula's history. And there's a really fun piece of memorabilia here, which is that, of course, this was the 1800s when Stoker was writing this book, so everything was written by hand. The page that he used to set up all the characters had a list of his various characters, and about halfway down the list, it's the bottom of the page here, it said the Count, and then after it said Count Vampire, and you can see if you look carefully, he's crossed it off and put Dracula. But that's not the only instance of Dracula on here. He wrote Dracula in the top right next to the cast list twice, one on either side of it, and then put Count Dracula at the top with extremely bolded word count, and then underlines it. Who does that? that's someone who's excited. That is someone who is very enthusiastic. That's somebody who has found a piece of information that he's incredibly thrilled about. So he was like, I'm going to call him Dracula. Yeah, Dracula, Dracula, Dracula. He literally scribbled it all over the page like he was an excited schoolboy. So to me, the very notion that somehow this historic Dracula character was an afterthought, an irrelevant piece of ephemera that doesn't really have an impact on the novel just seems ludicrous. And, all respect to Professor Miller and her incredible scholarship, I think that she let her personal, appreciation of semantics and the idea that he was based on Dracula sort of steamrolled the idea that the history of this character had tremendous effect on the way Stoker wrote the novel. So,
yeah. And people nowadays have created whole entire novels by simply cutting and pasting the first entry in Wikipedia on subjects. So I think that there's a lot more here going on with Stoker than what's going on in some books today.
No, I agree with you completely on that. And the thing is that Dracula is also what I call an evolutionary work of fiction. Stoker's novel was written in 1897, 125 years ago, but Stoker was only planting a seed, and that seed has grown and grown. And the legend of Dracula has simply grown to tremendous proportions. And as I say, it's broken off into various camps. You have the monstrous Dracula, you have the sexy and appealing Dracula, you have the villainous Dracula, the heroic Dracula, and there's certainly no end to it. I mean, at this point, there are at least 3 film projects currently in production. We just, actually, it's still probably in theaters right now, had a brand new Dracula that's been in theaters now for a couple of weeks. There's a new TV show that is being produced that's called The Bride. It's supposed to have, basically the story of the brides in modern day. And so the Dracula story just doesn't ever seem to die, which is perfectly okay by me. I do want to quickly address something is I think a big point of sort of fascination with people, and that is the existence of a real Castle Dracula. People constantly, and I'm sure you've seen photos of Castle Bran before, this amazing castle that is in the heart of Transylvania near the city of Brasov. But think about Castle Dracula, or rather Bran Castle, is that while practically every tourism agency would send you there if you said you wanted to go visit Castle Dracula, it actually has no direct connections to the historic Prince Vlad. It's the reason the castle got the reputation of being Castle Dracula was 100% a marketing ploy. It's a terrible thing to say, and it's absolutely worth visiting, but the real Castle Dracula isn't particularly marketable. The fictional Castle Dracula, or Castle Bran, it's this big, amazing castle. It's near a major city, so it's easy to get to. It's got a great tourism potential. You can tour the castle. It's got rooms and dungeons and everything else. It's everything you want in a tourism destination, Castle Dracula. But the real Castle Dracula is much less appealing to your average Joe, because first of all, it's ruined. It's a complete ruin. Panari Castle, which Dracula actually had rebuilt in the 1450s, is on a high mountaintop. It's 1,400 steps up the mountain to get to it. So your average, person, if your knees are starting to go later in life, like mine are, you're probably not going to make it up there. And it's just a ruin. It's got a small footprint, and a lot of it's fallen through earthquakes over the years. So unfortunately, there's not much left of it. Although I do have something fun, which is a reconstruction of what the castle might have looked like. Through the magic of CGI, we get a little sense of what Castle Dracula looked like in its heyday before it was destroyed by earthquakes and Turkish cannons.
That was pretty impressive.
Yeah, they did a great job with that, and they based it on other castles that exist to this day, like Castle Hunedoara, that still exist in Romania to this time. I had the great fortune to actually climb those 1,400 steps when I was a little bit of a young whippersnapper. I had that, yes, believe it or not, that guy with not a gray hair in his beard is me. That was 1996, and I had the great fortune of climbing the mountain to visit Castle Dracula and kind of setting me on this path. But to this day, I think that I'd love to go back there, but I'm not sure I could make it up that mountain anymore. So for the last couple of minutes here, and I do want to quickly give you one more fun little piece of information, something that I said earlier, that there was kind of the idea that this novel virtually wanted to be written. So Stoker loved the idea of this character, and he drew this connection between this character who's known as the devil and supposedly impaled his victims and all these terrible things, and felt that it made a great template for his vampire. So he took the legend or the history of the historical Vlad Dracula, superimposed it. He weaves little bits of that history through the novel Dracula to give it that extra sort of frisson of authenticity that he used the shipwreck for, and all these other things as well. But the one thing that he didn't realize, and I don't think he would have ever known it because it just wasn't a culture that he would have understood, is that the real historic Dracula, while never in any way considered a vampire during his life, may, in fact, have been feared as a vampire after death. It actually really could be a part of his legend, because one of the things that's fascinating about Romanian folklore is it's an Orthodox Christian tradition that Dracula would have been a part of, but Dracula ended up marrying a Catholic wife as a political move and pledged fealty to the Catholic Pope. And this put him directly at odds with the incredibly strict Orthodox Church, and he was excommunicated. This was in around 1476. And Dracula was an incredibly proud man and somebody who never would have admitted that he was wrong. And being excommunicated by the church is not something he would have ever come back from. He wouldn't have apologized to the church. So Dracula would have died excommunicated from the church of his birth. And that, according to the folklore of Romania, would have left him a strigoi. The strigoi are the wicked souls cast out from heaven's mercy, doomed to remain incorrupted in the grave and feed upon the living. It was believed to be the curse of any wicked soul. And so in folklore, Dracula's life would have actually ended up making him a Romanian vampire after death. I find that absolutely fascinating, and I wish Stoker had known that, because that would have been a great little piece of a little folklore to include in the book. But a little side note, it does have a crypt or a tomb in Romania. It's on the island of Snagov, a monastery in the island of Snagov. And in 1931, that crypt was open, and it is said to have been empty. So you can draw your own conclusions from that, but it seems as though the idea of the vampire Dracula may not be as far-fetched as even Stoker might have thought that it was.
This was a great tour, my friend. I enjoyed this, sitting back and just listening to you go, and I'm sure that the listeners did as well, too. You did a great job on it. If this is anything like your book, it's going to be a non-stop read. It's a must-read.
There's a lot of the content from here is found in my book, but there's a lot more detail. So if you enjoy that kind of thing, hopefully you would enjoy that as well. If anybody is interested in picking up a copy of Hunting Dracula, you can find it at ghostboypress.com, and that is my own printing imprint. I am self-published now, and I love it, and I don't think I'll ever look back. So if you order a copy of Hunting Dracula from ghostboypress.com, you get a signed copy, and I will mail it to you personally. So hopefully some of you folks will give that a try and enjoy that. But yeah, folks, it's been a wonderful quick blast through a little hour here. I hope you guys all had a good time. And Ron, thank you for putting up with me kind of talking over you for this. Sort of my ballywick today. So
I learned a lot from you, my friend, and I was looking forward to this. I'm glad that we came back on. This is the perfect time to come back on, and the perfect show to start off with.
We have a lot of fun shows coming up in the coming months. We're going to, I think we're going to do some great shows during the Halloween season. We're planning on doing a part 2 of our history of cinematic horror coming up during the Halloween season. We're going to do a show entirely on the history and origin of Halloween and All Hallows Eve and Samhain, which I think I'm going to have great fun with, because of course that's my favorite time of year. And I believe we're going to do one right before the Halloween comes about the Headless Horseman, another subject that is a real big favorite of mine. So we've got a lot of fun shows coming up, guys, and hopefully we will see you again in the coming weeks. And as always, thank you so much for coming out with us today. Please hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment below, let us know what you thought, any other questions, suggestions, and we absolutely love to hear from you guys. So Ron, always wonderful, super happy to be back, and it looks like we will see you next Monday, for the next episode of Monday Night Monsters.
Can't wait. We'll see you then.
Good night, guys.